A couple of weeks ago, I was casually writing a script on my MacBook Pro, something that I do frequently when, this time, I looked down at it and had the urge to play some games. But then I remembered, it's a Mac. But that was all good, because I could just install Windows and do it that way. When trying to install Windows, I also had the realization that I was only working with a 128GB SSD, so squeezing not only macOS, but Windows 10 and a couple of games was easier said than done. I also considered that my 2017 MacBook Pro also had one of the worst cooling designs, in my opinion, of all time. This led me into a weird train of thought about switching back to Windows. I spent days thinking about it, and which laptop I could go for. And then I found this, a Dell XPS 9550. This seemed like a great deal, especially considering I'd just sold my MacBook for close to the price of this anyway. So I went for it, and a few days and a few issues with tracking later, it arrived, and wow, this was way better than what I was expecting. So you're probably asking, what makes this so good? Well, for me, it was the sheer hardware upgrade over my old MacBook. Let's do a side by side here. The MacBook Pro has a 2.3GHz 7th generation i5 7360U, 8GB of RAM, a 128GB SSD, and Intel's Iris Plus 640 graphics. It looks quite good on paper, definitely a capable laptop, but then you look at what you can buy this for. From the same source as the Dell CEX, this would set you back £590, which is just over $800 if you're in the US. Bear in mind that this is for a 5-year-old laptop with a dual-core CPU. And now, the Dell. My one has a 6th generation i7 6700HQ, a 4-core 8-thread beast with a turbo clock of up to 3.5GHz. In the benchmarks I was able to find online, this is over twice as fast as the i5 in the MacBook. Then, there's the other hardware. The XPS has 16GB of RAM, double that of the MacBook. It also has a 512GB SSD, 4 times that of the MacBook. And the main reason I wanted this one was the graphics. The XPS has a GTX 960M, a card that on paper might sound old and underwhelming, but is surprisingly capable. In benchmarks, it outperforms both the Vega 8 and 11 graphics found in AMD's Ryzen CPUs. And finally, there's the price. This Dell XPS 15 set me back £500, which is a full £90 less than the MacBook Pro. With this comparison, I just wanted to highlight the sheer value of going for a Windows laptop over a Mac when buying used. You can get some serious value if you take the time to analyse all of your options like I did. Now let's talk about the build quality of this laptop. The XPS 9550 has a 15-inch 1080p display with a matte finish. It's perfectly capable for most of the things you'd want to do on here, including watching videos, gaming and video editing like I do. The bezel around the display is nice and thin, except for the bottom, but it's really not that noticeable while using it. The webcam is also oddly placed here. The keyboard here is nice too. The LED backlit keys themselves have little travel, which is especially nice for someone upgrading from a MacBook with similar keys. The palm rest and keyboard borders are made of a nice rubbery material, which doesn't seem to have worn away or become stained over the years of usage. I was surprised to discover that this laptop actually has a glass trackpad like MacBooks, and you can tell. Gestures in Windows 10 are easy, and I don't constantly feel the need to plug in a mouse like I have on a few other Windows laptops. The casing on both the lid and the bottom of the laptop is metal, and it makes the device feel really premium. The edges, however, are unfortunately made of plastic, but it doesn't really take away from the expensive feel. The stereo speakers, while not as good as something like a new MacBook, do sound quite good, and are certainly better than most phone speakers. One thing I will say is that despite the laptop being quite thin for what it is, the cooling design is excellent. The i7 does get really hot, and when the 960M joins in, you almost have a space heater on your hands. As a result, the fan does get quite loud, and yet this cooling design copes with it quite well. This cooler added to the hardware and premium materials does make the Dell quite heavy considering how thin it is, coming in at just over 2 kilos, about 3.9 pounds. You're probably wondering, how does this thing game? Well, I tried 4 titles that I own just to see, starting with the easiest to run, Call of Duty Black Ops 2. At 1080p on medium settings, the 960M achieved an average of 38 FPS, which is absolutely playable. There were a few frame drops here and there, and I noticed worse performance on larger maps, but the experience was decent nonetheless. The second game I tested was Phasmophobia. I had to really turn the settings down here to get it to be playable. At 720p on low settings, the laptop achieved an average of 34 FPS. This remained fairly stable on smaller maps, but really fluctuated on the larger ones. The next game I tested was Forza Horizon 3, a notably great looking game, especially at release. Surprisingly, at 1080p on low settings with VSync off, the game ran at a solid 30 FPS, and I very rarely experienced any frame drops. This was surprising to me. The game still looks great with these settings and is really playable. The final game I tested was Space Engineers, my all-time favourite game, other than Halo Reach. This was easily the biggest challenge for the GPU. At 1080p on low settings, the game ran decently, at around 30 to 40 FPS when I wasn't doing anything too complicated. When I started flying around fast, however, the 960M really started to struggle, and the game constantly froze. I do think this would run well without planets, but because the loading time for each map was at least 5 minutes, I really didn't want to try. Interestingly, I saw no performance loss by turning up the graphics to medium, so we could potentially be dealing with a CPU bottleneck here, but I do think that's unlikely. But what does all of this actually mean? For me, it all adds up to a really nice all-around experience. Obviously, you're not just going to play games on this. You're probably likely to do some work on it if you're at school, university or college, and that's where the good keyboard and trackpad come in. I personally use this as my college laptop now, and it's really good for that. It's a nice laptop for working on, and it has just enough graphics horsepower to run some games if you wanted to, and this is why I think it's the best replacement for a MacBook that money can buy. It looks unassuming, another office laptop that just blends into the background. Not many people are likely to look at this and want to steal it, whereas with a MacBook it's likely to turn a few heads, just because of the Apple logo. Sure, Macs are flashy, but you don't really want to risk losing all your work and hard-earned money just to stand out from the crowd. With this, you can do everything possible on a MacBook and more, without thermals being an issue. It makes sense, and that's why I bought one. Dell laptops are also known to be reliable. My grandparents still use one from 2010 with no issues, and my other grandparents have one all the way back from 2006 running Vista, and it's fine. Compare that with a MacBook from 2006. Most of them have dead batteries and can't run anything newer than a 2011 OS. Understanding how your device might age is just so important when buying something like this. This could last you 15 years or even longer. It's not just a fashion item, it's an investment into your future.